Welcome to Warhol in the West. I'm Seth Hopkins, the director of the museum, and I'm also the lead curator on this exhibition. It's one I've been working on since 2003, off and on. And this was the subject of my 2005 master's thesis. We'll talk more about that at 7 o'clock when we do the panel discussion, how we pulled all of this together. For now, though, we're going to talk about the objects that are in front of us and a little bit about the timeline of Andy's life. So Andy came to his love of the West the way most people over the age of 50 did, and that's through what?
TV shows.
TV shows and movies, right? So here's Andy's scrapbook with his movie star portraits in it. Here's some small ones that he got that were signed that he had written off to and asked the celebrities to send him.
Gene Autry.
Yeah, Gene Autry's the biggest one in the case, right?
Yeah.
Woo, Gene Autry. Guess what's right next to it?
Champion.
A Roy Rogers alarm clock. So we got Gene and Roy covered right off the bat. Andy, when he lists his favorite actors, often would include those two in the list. Also behind you there are some little giant books about the West. We got Buck Jones, we got Kit Carson, Buck and Buffalo Bill Cody. Now, whether he owned these books and this clock from his childhood on is pretty doubtful. These are probably things he saw in his childhood, wished he had. He grew up in a very poor part of Pittsburgh, and he saw them later in life and decided he wanted them, picked them up and had them in his collection. Behind those are some, the little red binder right there in front. He would put Polaroids that he took. He always had a Polaroid camera with him. He was always taking pictures of people, places, and things. He would put these little vignettes together with 20 Polaroids. This one is all pictures of Indian artifacts, which he was a big collector of. So there's baskets and beadwork and pottery and things in that book. It's number 135, so we know there's at least that many of these books. At Stanford University, they have 125,000 of his Polaroids online. You can go look at them today. It's great for insomnia. In the case behind that are cowboy boots. They have 27 pair of his cowboy boots at the Warhol Museum. We have 5 of them here in the exhibition. The ones around the bottom, most of them have paint on them, showing that he was using them in the studio while he was painting. Then the pair on top is pretty much pristine. That would probably be the one he saved and wore out to Studio 54 in the evenings after a hard day of painting, right?
Any famous makers, boot makers?
They're all, I think all 5 of these are Lucchese's. But he was known to buy some expensive ones. He bought at Weston's on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and others when he was traveling. But he was pretty much a cheapskate from everything we know. So somebody else had to be buying if he was going to do the real deal sometimes. Here on the screen behind us is Dennis Hopper. Oh, I forgot. Got a couple of cowboy hats and a bolo tie here too. I can just see Andy wearing that sheriff's badge bolo tie, can't you?
Yeah.
A little hat and boots. So one of his movie star friends from the earliest days was Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper was a big collector of modern and contemporary art. He had actually bought one of the Campbell's soup cans out of that first exhibition. He later sold it back to the dealer who had it because he wanted to keep all those together. They hadn't sold very many. That was a pretty bad move on Dennis's part. That might be $20, $30 million today if he'd held on to it. But one of the cool things in the exhibition is the photographs. Here's a picture of Dennis. Here's Dennis and Andy together at the opening of a big art show. Here's the Polaroid that Andy took to do this portrait of Dennis. Now he's reversed the image in the projection process. Now who remembers a Dennis Hopper movie that has a cowboy hat as a central element in the plot? Anybody remember Giant?
Yeah.
Remember in Giant he couldn't measure up to his dad? And he gets the cowboy hat for Christmas. He goes to put it on. It's 2 sizes too big. He just literally can't measure up to his dad's expectations. So I think what Andy did is took care of his buddy and made sure this time the hat fit. Working from this Polaroid.
His dad in the movie was Rock Hudson.
I don't remember.
The Giant?
Anybody remember? Yeah, Rock Hudson? One of the things Andy would also do is these screen tests, he called them. And he would do them to put people off their game or maybe to make them feel as uneasy as he often did. He would have 100 feet of film in a film camera. He'd set you in front of it, he'd start it going, and he'd leave. And you were left to sit there like Dennis is doing, staring into the camera or fiddling with your thumbs or your hair or whatever it might be. Maybe smoke a cigarette. And eventually he'd come back when the film was all flapping, running around in the film projector. There's hundreds of these at the Warhol Museum, from famous people to people who just showed up like the mailman, part of his screen test series. Speaking of movies, this is a movie that was made in the 90s called I Shot Andy Warhol. There was a lady who busted into the studio in 1968 and shot him several times. She would have killed him, but the last bullet jammed in the gun. He went to the hospital. They operated for several hours. He was given last rites at one point and presumed to be dead, but he survived. But he had physical and psychological scars from that the rest of his life. He often wore a girdle to keep his insides kind of in. And this movie came out later by a British production company after his death. So he got shot, but he later did a series on guns and knives. Now, whether that was cathartic and that was kind of him getting over it, I don't know. But if we start psychoanalyzing Andy, we're on the edge of the abyss, right? So let's not go there. The genius of Andy has been said that he was a mirror to America. He held a mirror up to America and said, this is who and what you are. You are Campbell's Soup and Brillo and Heinz Ketchup. You're Elvis and Marilyn Monroe, Jackie O, whoever it might have been, dollar signs. Definitely American, right? So when he chooses Elvis as a subject, he doesn't choose Elvis as a teen singing sensation. That would have been Americana. Doesn't choose him as a matinee idol teen singing sensation, double Americana. He chooses him as a gunslinging Western movie star matinee idol teen singing sensation. Triple Americana, right? So he hits a home run with this. This is truly American. And we could have got one of these paintings here, maybe. He did about 35 of these paintings of Elvis. If you get your hands on one, they're $50 or $100 million each. They're flaking apart because he used cheap paint on them and it keeps flaking off. So the people that got them don't loan them. Or it would have cost us more than this whole exhibit put together to get the one painting here. So we didn't go there. Instead, we gave you 8 of his paintings instead of just one, right?
Yeah, good.
This is a recreation of the exhibition of the original work in California in the early 60s. But Andy was an international superstar, not just in America. I said that's a British production company that did that movie. Here's an exhibition in Canada of this body of work. This is Cologne, Germany. And the orange lobby cards over there, we'll get to in a minute, those are from Germany as well. When you get in the back part of the exhibition, you'll see things from Mexico related to Andy's work. So all over the world, he's a phenomenon. Yet he keeps coming back to what's quintessentially American. Like this guy, right? Sing it for me.
It's howdy-do time.
Nobody ever knows the second line. We're going to have to look that up. But here's Howdy Doody. Does it get any more American than that? And one of the things that was driven home to me in how quintessentially American and universal this was, one of the critics wrote about one time at one of the Ivy League campuses in the late 60s, the ROTC kids and the anti-war kids laid down their differences to come see Buffalo Bob and sing Howdy Doody songs. That was the anti-polarizing effect of Howdy Doody. And Andy could recognize that that was a quintessentially American moment, to have Howdy Doody included in a series he did called Myths. And that series included him as a self-portrait, Santa Claus, the Wicked Witch of the West, Uncle Sam, things like that he considered mythic things in America. And he's also applied what he called diamond dust to this. This is crushed glass that's added, gives it the bling factor and really makes it iridescent. Pretty cool. And again, here's the Polaroid that Andy shot to do this image. So the screen tests make up a lot of Andy's movie production, but he did lots and lots of other movies, including 8 Hours, the thriller, Empire State Building. Just 8 hours of the Empire State Building. Spoiler alert, nothing happens. Or 6 hours of a guy sleeping when he turns over twice. Those were some of his big movies. Keep coming, guys.
Is that a photograph of him?
Yes, yes. So he made 2 Westerns. This one is called Horse. They had rented what they thought was a small horse. This brute shows up with a trainer. And this is not really scripted. It's meant to just be improvised off some cue cards that were held off stage. And these are the doors to the studio. Throughout the movie, people come and go in the middle of this. There's a payphone back there. See the guy? He's getting on the payphone back there making a phone call. Andy was worried it looked too real, too much like a real Western. So he had him put the mic boom in here and the light fixture within the frame so you'd know that it wasn't a real Western. And so at some point a fight breaks out. At another point a strip poker game breaks out. And in the last scene there's a guy standing in his underwear singing an opera aria. And so he called this a farcical Western. Maybe he was keying in on some of the critics who used to call the Gene and Roy movies horse operas instead of soap operas. So maybe this was a literal horse opera in Andy's mind. Now he goes the other direction when he makes this film, Lonesome Cowboys. And they rent out the old Tucson filming location, Tucson, Arizona, which had become a tourist attraction. People could come watch movies being made. So this is a 2-hour-plus movie. Here's the script. That's it. That's the script. So when you rented Old Tucson, you got some technicians that came with it that would help with the film production. And those guys were standing around going, every time they do a scene, it's different. Because they were improvising all the time. And he said, doesn't anybody ever yell cut around here? Well, they would just put a roll of film in and go till it was gone, take it out, load it up, put another one in, keep right on going. There was no rhyme or reason to it. Now, everything you need to know about this movie is in this sentence right here. And those of you in the back can't see it, I'll read it. It says, Lonesome Cowboys is a magnificent and very funny satire of an American Western that is seasoned liberally with our favorite 4, 8, 10, and 12-letter words. I'll have to count those later. And a cornucopia of nudity and sexual carryings-on that in combination is perhaps unprecedented. Now, this film won Film of the Year in San Francisco. In Atlanta, it was seized for being pornographic. So that was kind of the range of what happened. Now, there's a simulated rape scene in the middle of the movie, and when the tourists that were there touring Old Tucson saw that, soon the FBI was on the case, and they were hanging out watching the filming, just waiting for somebody to do something so they could lock these guys up. So they left Old Tucson, they went to a private ranch to finish this, and eventually released it as a full-length movie. So these really look like cowboys, don't they? They look a little better in the film clips and these lobby cards. But here's Andy right in the middle of it with his cowboy hat on. Looks like he's doing a lot of the filming. So obviously he was probably engaged in the production. So on the monitors we have very carefully selected G-rated highlights of the movies, okay? If you want to see anything beyond that, that's between you and the internet. Okay? Next we're going to talk about artists, if you'll come on around this way. Yeah, okay. Do it real quick. So 3 artists here that Andy did portraits of, 2 of whom are in the permanent collection. You got Fritz Shoulder right here, and you actually have a letter from Fritz to Andy saying he had gotten the portraits in good condition and he liked them very much. He also thanked Andy for a good time when they were visiting in New York, when he would have shot those pictures. Another artist that he did that's in our collection is R.C. Gorman right here. He was known as the Indian Picasso in the New York Times. Both these guys used the portraits that Andy produced to help their careers. They advertised in the shows of their work going forward, come see Andy's portraits of me and buy some of my work. And then somebody who didn't need that kind of help, of course, was Georgia O'Keeffe. She may be the only person who could rival Andy for as much fame as he had in American art in the last 100 years. I think he's done a wonderful job with her. Kind of a ghost-like image. Got that diamond dust going again. And she visited the studio when she was 96. They talked about what they should do for her 100th birthday. I'm afraid they jinxed it. She died at 98 and a half, so she didn't make it. But these were 3 artists that had relationships with Andy who did Western art, 2 of them in our collection. So that's kind of cool that we can tie that in with Andy's work, okay? All right, Sam Gerace, our photography curator, is going to meet you right here to take on the rest of the tour. Again, I'm Seth Hopkins, the director. Thanks for coming out, and we'll see you at 7 o'clock at the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. All right, if we can just get a little bit closer because we're about to go sort of in an in-between. I just want to briefly mention also the screen print of Russell Means. We can see a few things here with Warhol. Not only is this sort of a screen print, which you can see sort of in the small dotting on the faces of how the shadow sort of looks like a newsprint, but he's also gone back and painted over it. And this is one of those fascinating things about Warhol, is he always said something to the effect of his meaning was on the surface and that he wasn't political or that he wasn't thinking of anything deep at the time. But at this moment in 1976, when he was approached about this idea of doing working with these American Indian figures and doing a portrait series, many of his informants suggested Russell Means, who was an incredibly important American Indian activist at the time. In fact, in order to sort of pay for his rights, Warhol actually donated $5,000 to AIM, which was Russell Means' activist group that would stage things like they took over Alcatraz, and they used sort of loopholes in treaties with the American Indians and the American government that said American Indians could occupy anything that the American government wasn't using. So they called that bluff, and it worked out to, as we can see, it was a bit crazy. But this one, again, goes into that aspect of, Warhol is always doing something a bit more, always doing something a bit below the layer, however he wants to say that. And so with that, we're going to go more further in this way. And if I could get you to sort of surround these artifacts real quick, because this will be a great way to sort of see everything that's in this exhibit. So at this point, at this section of the exhibit, what we're here and what we're talking about is Warhol as a collector. In the 1960s, Warhol was a rabid collector. His partner, Jed Johnson, would talk about how he would go out and collect, or really buy many, many, many things. When he was sort of musing about why Warhol wouldn't, spend money on one giant piece. Why not get one big thing? And he sort of laughed and said, well, Warhol wanted to buy a lot of things. If you only spend something on one thing, you've cut your shopping spree by a lot. And so sort of that's the idea of what we're having with Warhol. What's very interesting about this is that these things that you're seeing right here were part of the Sotheby's auction in the late 80s. And this was a part of a fundraiser for the foundation and also the museum later on. The thing about this and the thing about Warhol as a collector was that when they went in to try and sort of catalog everything, it was just rooms and rooms and rooms full of things. So you had like a 7-story house in New York, and maybe only 2 or 3 rooms were actually lived in. The rest were just full of the things he collected. So in a lot of cases, you see these fabulous photographs on the other side over there of this beautiful array of everything on a table and presented and presentable. But in the actual reality, it would be under boxes and sort of hidden away. That doesn't mean that Warhol treasured them any less and that they weren't as important to him. It's just that this image of, a fully staged Warhol home is a bit of a misnomer in that regard. Interestingly enough, the photographs appeared in House and Garden, and they were taken by Robert Mapplethorpe, which unfortunately and quite sort of shockingly, he died a year later, almost less than a year. And so that's an interesting sort of thing. It was one of the last things he did. And there's actually a portrait of Mapplethorpe over in Scene in the Picturing America Gallery as well. So these are the types of things that Warhol was fascinating about. As we can see, he was interested not only in American Indian artists, but also American Indian artifacts. And the reason he liked them in a lot of cases was because of their sort of geometric pattern. Warhol is a pop artist. Warhol was actually did design, was into fashion. Some of his early drawings are these incredibly intricate shoes and jewelry and things along those lines. And so it's no wonder that Warhol can look at something like this, giant pendant, full of turquoise and embedded jewels, and be a bit drawn to that. It's a bit sort of familiar to him in a lot of cases. So, just trying to make sure I keep the time. So with that, there was 2,526 lots in the Sotheby's auction. It took about 10 days. And so it was this huge, huge, huge affair. Also in it were about 300 Curtises. So these are the photographs and pictures of the early 1900s. And this is where we actually started to get a little bit into, one of Warhol's quotes was, all is fantasy. And this is actually mentioned in the catalog as well by Heather Anthon. And it was with a interview with Paul Taylor. And really, I think the Curtises do such a good job of this aspect of fantasy because the Curtises not only help us document what American Indian culture and dress and garb was like in the early 1900s, but at the same time, there is this aspect of fantasy as well. Curtis made sure that he removed all elements of the modern to make these images seem timeless. He used wet plate collodion, which is a process that actually darkened the skin, but also helps increase the tonality. So that's why so many of these, their eyes are so deep, their skin is so rich, and there's so much texture that you're getting. So while they document dress, in a lot of cases, they're a fantasy. They're what the American Indians were, not necessarily what they were at that moment in time. And so I could see how Warhol was drawn to these and wanted to collect them, not only as important pieces of American history and also American art, but also you see, the baskets and the clothing and the jewelry again, and you get into all those wonderful, fascinating details. And we have here again a Navajo blanket. Warhol famously said that these were some of his favorite, again, the geometric stuff. As you can see, it has lots of little holes in it, which Warhol actually said he loved. He said it made it more geometric. He enjoyed the things that weren't perfect in that regard. So it's one of those situations where, and it was actually mentioned quite often, especially at the auction, that collectors were sort of mystified by Warhol. They were like, this isn't a collectible piece. This isn't something that you invest money in. But for Warhol, it meant something different. It was much more about the geometry of it and also the joy of being able to buy 10 blankets, instead of just one. He wanted much about quantity, which is really interesting as we sort of move over into the screen printing aspect. So with thinking of all of this in mind, and this is, again, as you're sort of seeing, this middle room is a transition piece. So it's a transition from the film to Cowboys and Indians. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about the screen printing process. To just briefly explain it, we have some wonderful test pieces right here showing how a screen printing process is done by Columbus State University. They're amazing and helped us set these up. And really what it is, screen printing is ancient. It started in China in like 900 to 1200. But what we have here is a very simple process. Silk or nylon would have a photographic emulsion over it. It would harden. They would expose it to light, and you use a sort of like negative, sort of printed on plastic, that would burn the image in. They would wash it off, and then all of a sudden you have a stencil. And then it works exactly like a stencil. Effectively, that is exactly what it is. You have a squeegee, you put it down, you get your next stencil out, and as you can see, you can build layer over time to get something very rich and very different. Now, obviously, Cowboys and Indians was not the first time Warhol did screen printing. Behind you, you have the bald eagle and ram as part of his endangered animal series. And to your right, you have sunset. And this is actually really interesting because with the sunset, it was a 33-minute movie of a sunset. There is some poetry and sort of spoken word with Nico from Velvet Underground. But he actually made a screen printing for a luxury hotel. And this is actually what I love about this one, because it's, let me get the number right, 632 unique prints. So these are screen prints, which is something that you can mass produce. But every single one of them is different. And what's fascinating about this, because it just shows that Warhol's mindset, that's hotel art. That is by definition hotel art. and that's what Warhol does. That's, that's his genius in a lot of cases. He makes sure that it's accessible, and he makes sure that, things that we sort of take for granted every day. We think of the Campbell soup can, but like, what is more iconic than the sunset, especially for Westerns? The cowboy running off into the sunset on his horse. And here we have this sort of meditation on that, that Warhol's done. Now, moving over to the Cowboys and Indians, and so here we have a little bit of a taster. And the next room over, you'll get a nice sort of full explanation, so I don't want to go too into this. But it was a project started in the 1980s. Kleiman and Galtney were partners with Warhol in this. Kleiman sort of had artistic control, much to Warhol's dismay. And interestingly, here are some of the two issues that came up. So the one on our left is John Wayne. Originally, Warhol wanted to use Clint Eastwood as a subject. He was younger, more attractive, I guess, in that regard, and maybe would resonate with a younger audience. Eastwood said no, and so they went to work with the John Wayne estate instead. There was a bit of a confusion about how to get rights, though, because this is actually from a movie. This is Who Shot Liberty Valance. So with that, and it's straight from the lobby card, which you'll actually see one original library card from Mexico in the other room. So you can actually see how it was just straight up lifted. Now this is the thing. So they were able to do a bunch of test prints and then actually completed part of it in the series. However, the Wayne estate eventually sued. This is actually very frustrating for Warhol because it was not his responsibility to deal with. It was actually supposed to be, Kleiman's. He was the one that was in charge of making sure that was all paid for. Because if you have a unique image, like let's say you paint it, if he painted this with oil paint or something, and to be considered a unique image, copyright would not involve. However, because it's a reproduction, because it's a series, copyright, was invoked. So Warhol, being clever, they had some that were sent out. They had them sent back to Warhol. So these are already in the collector's hands, and Warhol's going, please send them back for mysterious reasons. Everything's fine. So what he does is he gets them and he changes things. He changes tiny details on every single one. So he takes and you can sort of see this here. So in one case, he'll make the gun blue. And then he'll erase the serial number, which would be out of 250, and then stamp unique on it. So there you go. It didn't quite work because they settled out of court later on. But you can sort of see that aspect. Equally with that as well, we have Sitting Bull to your right. And this is actually really exciting because what they would do is trial proofs. Because Warhol was all about what was commercial, what was exciting, what would grab people's attention. And the colors weren't just random, so you had to sort of experiment. And so here are sort of 3 examples of those experimentations. Those experimentations would run in a series of 36. Sometimes they'd say like TP 1/36 to let you know that it was a test print. These are one of those situations where it's very interesting because they're test prints, so you think they're rarer, so that makes them more valuable, but they're not the ones that are recognized, so they're less valuable, but they are valuable because they're more unique. So it's one of those interesting things about art history and collecting and sort of the complications therein. But with this one, you can sort of see how they're playing with the background. In the Goff photograph that Warhol was using, there was sort of fake scenery behind him, and you can sort of see that in the right one, there's sort of a little bit of that being invoked in that regard. But then he was like, no, let's play with color instead. And that is, again, a common theme that you'll see with Warhol, is that this aspect of color is very important, and this play is very important. And because why not be interactive? We have our fabulous little kiosk right here, so you can be a part of the creative process and pick which one your favorites are, and see if, does it match up with what they picked, which is always fun. So we're going to move you over to the next one, where you can actually appreciate the entirety of the suite, even the ones that were eventually taken out.
My name is Lisa Wheeler, and I'm the Director of Curatorial Services here at the Booth Museum. And the first thing I want to clarify is I had absolutely nothing to do with the scholarship for this exhibit. It was totally Seth and Faith Brower, who you'll probably hear from later tonight, and a host of other scholars across the country that created the book and helped to curate the exhibit. What my goal in here tonight is to show you the last major work that Andy Warhol ever did, which was his Cowboy and Indians suite or portfolio featured here in this room. Another thing that's unique to this is you get to see all 14 of the images, not just the 10 that made the absolute final cut for the portfolio. And with this are the source materials. You've probably figured out by now he appropriated a lot of the images that he created from original source materials, other source materials. So on all the pedestals are the actual materials he used to come up with the idea for the image, and I hope you'll explore those some tonight as well. There were, the way it started is there was an artist in New York named Edmund Galtney, and probably around 82, 83, he had the idea to approach Andy about putting together this portfolio. And he needed money to help back the project, so he approached Kent Kleinman, who was an investment banker in New York at that time. Together they approached Andy, and he agreed to do it. But something went wrong in terms of the legal issues, the contracts and such, because somehow or other Kent Kleinman managed to get final say over the portfolio and what images would actually make it into the final cut. That never happened, to Andy before, and it became very contentious. A lot of arguing and fighting and delays of the project due to that fact. Starting here, I want to show you which pieces did not make the cut, and that would be Sitting Bull over here on this wall, and then over here on the wall near me, the War Bonnet Indian didn't make it, nor did Action Picture right here, or the Buffalo Nickel over there. Those four were not included in the final portfolio. There were 250 that were sold, and the going price that I read in the book was $15,000 for a set. I also wanted to mention that I'm not, what I'm telling you is stuff I read out of the book. I encourage you to get the book, and then you'll have a much more in-depth understanding of the exhibit. I want to start over here with the John Wayne. There was an enormous legal fight here. Andy didn't have permission from the John Wayne estate to use this image. He appropriated it from this movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and you can see the image right here. And this caused a huge uproar with the estate. You probably heard it in the room before you came in here, but they actually, once the owners received their portfolios, they were asked to return the John Waynes, and he was going to try to mark each of them as unique by changing one color on each piece so that they would be unique, and hopefully that would make the legal argument go away, but it didn't work, and it was settled for nobody knows how much money eventually out of court. And then if you'll come around the corner a little bit, if you take a look at the War Bonnet Indian and then position yourself where you can see Action Picture, those two were not selected for the portfolio, and it's because Kent Kleinman thought that they had too much movement and too much depth of field. And you can also argue depth of field with the Kachinas over here, but he just felt that those two just had too much going on to be in a set with the other ones with the nice white, pristine backgrounds. So those two didn't make the cut. One of the real coups for Seth Hopkins in this exhibit is that painting. That painting is by Charles Schreibogel. He was, up there with Remington in the world of painters, but he was not as prolific. And so a lot of people and collectors didn't even know he existed, but he's an excellent painter. That's one of the most famous paintings in American art history, and it normally lives at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's the image that Andy appropriated when he created this silkscreen here. On this wall, these three, Andy went to the Museum of the American Indian, and he had an appointment to go through some of the Native American objects that they had, and he took his trusty Polaroid with him, and he photographed the Plains Indian shield in their collection, the Conchina, and the Northwest Coast Plains mask. And I'm sure he stored those in those little red books like the one you saw in the other room. That would have been very normal behavior for him. As far as the 1913 Buffalo and Indian head nickel, that was created by the famous sculptor James Earl Frazier. He created the sculpture outside the Oklahoma Museum of Last End of the Trail with the Native American very defeated and leaning over on the horse. Seth says that he thinks that they knew they were only going to put one side or the other of the coin in the collection or in the set. And Seth says he thinks they settled it by simply flipping a coin. That's how they decided. One of the most controversial pieces in the collection is the Teddy Roosevelt here. You'll notice that he only used from about here up from the source image, but the thing that's controversial about it is he put him in blackface. And if you read the book, it's very interesting. There's a couple of different takes on this, but the way it started was that Kent Kleinman was aware of a sculpture featuring Teddy Roosevelt outside the Museum of Natural History in New York. And with him in the sculpture, there was or is an American Indian, and there's what Kent Kleinman thought was an African American, but that wasn't true. There was an American Indian, which the point was he was representing America, and then there was an actual African from the continent of Africa representing Africa. And Kent Kleinman thought it was the other way around and claimed that Teddy was a racist. And there was a big, brouhaha over it, and he ends up approving the portfolio with him in blackface. And then over here, the mother and child. Think about what images you're aware of that Andy Warhol did or produced through the years. So many of them were, popular people and movie stars and, society folks and just all kinds of people with a lot of notoriety. And here's this sweet, nice portrait of this Indian mother with her sleeping child. Well, it turns out, and this is according to Faith Brower, who again was one of the curators on this project, it turns out that Andy was extremely close to his mother, and she lived with him from 1952 until 1972 when she passed away. And the portraits he did of her were always very sweet and subdued, and Faith comments that it's his respect for motherhood that you see here in this particular image. And then over here, the sitting bull, he's placed here for a reason, because his nemesis was General Custer, And Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defeat General Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Battle of Greasy Grass, whichever you prefer to call it. And so everybody thought, well, that's a shoe-in. This portrait will go because of Custer being here. But instead, they decided to pick Geronimo, and the reason they picked Geronimo is he was the last of like the resistance fighters for the Native Americans back in that time period. And because Andy had an affinity for Russell Means, who was the modern day person advocating for Indian rights, then they thought the Geronimo was the better fit for the portfolio. And then here, Custer, if you look at the source photo, his uniform is dark, everything is dark. And here, theoretically, Andy had no political swayings one way or another, but in this one, a lot of people, I think the way Seth put it in the book is, a lot of people think he was either an absolute fool or an absolute brilliant person who was martyred for the cause, one or the other, no middle ground. And so Seth says you can clearly see Andy's political view on this, because instead of doing the uniform, he's used red, which is the color that attracts the eye more than any other color. It's what business people wear when they're going to look at all the politicians. They're going to have on that red tie, every time. And then he's put him in saintly white here in terms of the outfit with the sparkling gold buttons. So it looks like Andy was on the side of martyred hero there. And then the last of them is Annie Oakley over there. And this is her source photo. It came from this book about Annie Oakley by Courtney Cooper. And the thing about it, if you think about her, she's a strong, very strong woman, being able to outshoot men in all those competitions and things. She even ends up marrying one of the ones she beat, which was kind of fun. And then she's also, at the same time, very sweet and effeminate. And this is an unusual portrait. He is uplifting Annie Oakley, like bringing her to the forefront here in this room mostly of men. And the thing about it is that if you think about his real life work with women, movie stars, for example, it's always people who've suffered tragedy. For example, Marilyn Monroe dying at a very young age, Elizabeth Taylor, thank you. Elizabeth Taylor, who has suffered a lot through lots and lots of illnesses, not to mention all those husbands that she had. And then Jackie Kennedy, and having all that grace and poise when her husband was assassinated, and that's normally the type of person he would do portraits of, but no, not here for this suite. I'm happy to answer any questions, if I can, that you might have, or please do spend time enjoying the source materials before you have to move on to the next place. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.